Hey, everybody. Yodit Mesfin Johnson, News President and CEO. And I am here with friend and colleague, Jeanne Bell, who you'll get to
Hi.
shortly. And Jeanne and I, are taking a go at a vlog, a video recording of News October blog, which is focused on reimagining our organizations through a justice-centered lens, and thinking about design, strategy, and perhaps a new concept, sociocracy, new to some, that New is embarking on. To ground us, I wanted to start with New's theory of change, and I'll talk more in a sec about why I thought this was a good place to begin. In 2020, Jeanne, shortly after I had become CEO, of course, the pandemic happens. We have the murder of George Floyd, which really ignites a new movement and fight for racial justice. And I, at that point, I think was certainly over a decade here at New, but then nearing 20 years in the social sector. And working primarily all of that time with first small business owners, women and people of color. And then when I got to New, community-based organizations, nonprofits, many of whom were either serving or led by, Black folks, brown folks, Indigenous folk, queer folk, what people typically call historically marginalized communities. And it was, maybe by 6 months in that I built up the courage to say out loud, like as an organizational leader, that I believed, and I think the evidence points to, that our sector exists because of unequal power dynamics, systemic racism, and other forms of oppression. And that the reality is, folks who have privilege have used not only our sector, but other systems to exclude, discriminate against, and bar others from accessing power. And so as a result of that, and I think this kind of cumulative effect, for me at least, was observing very similar dynamics across the hundreds and, at this point, thousands of organizations we've worked with. And a few of those dynamics that we would see with clients included, primarily focusing on downstream issues, right? And in very urgent and responsive and necessary ways, but in that kind of reactionary position. There is a culture of, understandably, because of the external forces of philanthropy and the way that that works, this sense of competition and scarcity, right? We don't have enough, we can't do this or we can't do that. We can't even look upstream because we have to be focused on what's happening right now and the urgency of that. Often organizations that we worked with might have a vision statement, but they didn't really have a clear, time-bound, inspiring and strategically sound picture of what the future would look like as a result of their work. And not a lot of hope. I can remember talking to a donor and talking about eradicating poverty. And his response was, "We'll never eradicate poverty." And just thinking like, well, if we think that way, we certainly won't, right? But hope, Mariam Kaba always says, hope is a discipline. And when the former two things I mentioned are happening, it can be hard, frankly, to be hopeful in our work. And some of that is because that work requires labor and tasks and a way of working and being that have contributed to burnout on many folks. And I think that's particularly acute now, as organizational leaders have had to lead their organizations through, not just a global pandemic, but the economic precarities that have come along, rollbacks now in funding and funding for racial justice, but funding in general, the rollback of key policies, including SCOTUS's decision around affirmative action, which is also impacting the sector. And then the other thing that we know that these unequal power dynamics, which include like how money flows into the sector and all of that, contribute to organizations kind of directing any resource they get towards programs and not that vital back office piece, right? Which is not just having an office, but also like strong IT systems and strong accounting systems and the ability to do planning and to hire folks like, you or me, Jeanne. So that was kind of the context in 2020. And because of the way resources were flowing and what we were up against, I asked my team pretty early into my leadership, how do we know we have the right to be here? Not new is what's known as an intermediary, which means we're working across the system, right? We are not direct service providers. We're working with other organizations, mostly human service organizations, mostly small organizations, relatively, the budget's $500,000 or less. And so if we are in the space, I want to know that we are making, a significant and meaningful impact in the sector, right? Not just the transactional exchange of services, but really helping organizations make an impact. So this document that I have up, Our Theory of Change, is what has been guiding our thoughts about strategy, about organizational design, and about how we govern ourselves. And feeling a real call to listen to and respond to those communities that have experienced being under-resourced, have been historically marginalized, and who also often are designing and surviving and thriving amid these systems by practices and ways of being that I think the sector can benefit from, that we can look to communities that have experienced oppression most acutely, right, to help guide us, not just the other way around. So we made a decision that we would center those impacted communities. We also made a decision that it was important to turn towards each other, that if we've been put in a position to compete and to really look at most of our work through this lens of scarcity, then perhaps the counter to that would be that we lean and turn towards each other and that we start to build collective power. And while it is important for us to name the things that are broken, we cannot spend all of our time wagging our finger at the bad, right? We've got to also focus our attentions towards building the future we want. And so this tagline of transforming the future together, which lots of folks here may see or hear us promoting, is really born of that. This idea that we are being called to not just incrementally tinker in these systems, but to really get courageous and bold and thoughtful about how to transform them, how to dismantle that bad and how to build the new. And ultimately, we want to really shift the narrative and the paradigms of traditional nonprofit, management and leadership, and also this idea that we're sort of the third sector here to, just help the lesser than, but that, as evidenced in during the pandemic and during the racial unrest of 2020 and 2021, it was in fact community-based organizations, nonprofits, mutual aid groups that really held our communities together. So I want us to get our props, right? And that's what's on my mind. And then just a final piece that I would share relative to how we change, right, is we organized our theory of change, which is to say, I named all that current conditions and context, Our vision, we've recently written a 10-year vision, but synthesized, it's this idea that leaders need to be empowered, and that it's not our job to empower them, but to make available the resources and the connections to one another that allow them to build power individually and collectively. That the future that we long for is one where organizations are durable and flourishing, and they have evidence of that both in their budgets and in their staff and in the impact of their programs, and that those things contribute to a more vibrant society. And so if the current context is what I described and what I just described is what the future looks like, then what you see in front of you on this slide is really what we believe gets us from current state to future state. So building that collective leadership and power, strengthening operations of our organizations, disrupting traditional nonprofit management paradigms, board level and in the organization. And then for new, part of our contribution to change is using our positional power and influence to shift the narrative, to influence systems towards new ways of thinking and working and being together, both in our organizations and in our neighborhoods. So sounds great. I'm gonna stop sharing, Jeanne. That all sounds good. And then you
I'm in.
it all sounds good, but then you get in the messy middle of it. And I would say that's where we've been. And by messy middle, I mean the actual work of change and transformation, right? The interrogation of our organizations, our beliefs, our, how we're advancing our work. And what I hope today in dialogue with you is that our listeners and readers get curious about how to redesign their organizations in ways that move us closer to justice, and how important it is to recognize and actually embrace the impermanence and the iterative nature of this work, right? So before I go on, let's fully bring you into space, Jeanne Bell. Tell the people about yourself. A little bit more
Well, I
about.
want to be very brief because all that info is available, at Google, and I can't wait to talk more about so many of the things you said. But one of the things you said is that you're an intermediary, and one way of introducing myself is that I too have worked in and governed in intermediaries for a good percentage of my career. So I came through leadership development and capacity building. I was the executive director of an organization like new in the Bay Area called Compass Point, but worked there. I was an internal ED, so I was there 10 years before I was the ED. So that was a huge chunk of my experience, was working with an intermediary that, not unlike new, was also challenging its own assumptions about whose capacity needs to be built, in what ways, by whom, right? And going through its own racial justice reckoning and its own sort of unlearning process. Yeah. So that, I think we have some of that in common. And I serve on the board of Borealis Philanthropy, so I'm looking at that sort of philanthropic intermediary space. I do a lot of work with Nonprofit Quarterly, which is a media platform intermediary. So a lot of really all of the work that I've done before getting to this organizational design piece has been in the intermediary space, supporting other organizations. And then in the last 3 years, a colleague and I got together and blended our skills and experiences around organizational design and technology, and we can talk a little bit about that. But the thrust of this conversation is around organizational design, and what it really, for me, that came out of seeing the limitations of, say, strategic planning in the context that you just described, where people are starting to adopt strategies that don't match the traditional sort of siloed top-down model, not just in terms of values, where but which is important in terms of shared leadership and such, but literally in terms of executing the strategy, dividing people into functional groups isn't always the best actual design, regardless of your values.
Right.
To work on interdisciplinary things like power building, like narrative change,
Right.
et cetera. Those aren't really departments in many
Right.
ways. And so we try to lay those strategies on top of existing departments, and we find that it's insufficient. So that really got us interested in, well, if we're going to be adopting justice strategies, how do we support people to have some agency and creativity in designing their organization? So that's where my focus is now.
And I came to you because that's exactly where we were. We had followed your work, for many years, and I think done a lot inside of the organization and inside the design, right? But really important point that you brought up, because that is where things got tricky for us, is once we set the theory of change, it inherently required that our team be working cross-functionally, right? It's not like you're only building power, like you said, in this department, right? But you're trying to think about, how are we building power? What are the strategies and the practices that help to do that? And so we started by like adding percentages of time that people would spend doing particular things. And so our job descriptions went from like 2 pages to 7 pages. Then it got harder in terms of thinking about pay, because what happens when I hired you to be a bookkeeper, but now I'm asking you to be a part of, or to add in not just bookkeeping, but power building with your clients. And our former VP of strategy said, I just saw somewhere that Jeanne Bell is working on org design. And so I called you up because not only we had already, as part of our strategic plan, established that we wanted to structure shared and distributed leadership here, right? We wanted that across our board. We wanted it across the organization. And I think it was really popular at the time, like everybody wanted to be a co-leader and right? But even that, like, we had in our budget one salary line item for a CEO or executive director. So like, you're trying to play with buckets and pockets of money to kind of squeeze the structure or the design. I'm sorry, squeeze the design, this new design, into an established structure. And so I was really excited that Carrie, who was with us at the time, kind of brought you and the work you were doing into the mix. And just before we started working together, I'd learned from a different board that I'm on and gotten really fascinated around sociocracy, which simply put is a peer-driven governance system based on consent. But what I loved about it, and was seeing up close, is that it was also really practical in terms of how do decisions get made, and what do we do when we have conflict around decisions, right? All things that even when we were thinking about how to structure the organization, we would get stuck and hung up on. So we had started to learn about that and kind of tinker with that when you came on board. And I think the question that we had then, and one that I'm holding now, is, what does it mean, Jeanne, to design towards justice?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a question we're going to be answering for the rest of our natural lives, probably. As Adrienne Maree Brown talks about, this is science fiction to some extent, because we've all been so acculturated, and the larger systems are still assuming certain structural truths, right? And you bring up compensation, and it's very important because as soon as you walk into this door, I mean, within a week of walking into the door of design, somebody's going to say, well, what's that going to do to our compensation model,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And it is going to challenge it.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't tell you it's not, because we're moving to a more interdisciplinary, shared leadership, situational leadership kind of world, and that doesn't lend itself as well to siloed compensation that's really by functional expertise. So the compensation just follows from the kind of current shop floor thinking that we all are broken up into our functional units. Well, what's the
Yeah.
market value of that functional unit, right?
Right.
And it just goes from there. But you've laid it out, and with your beautiful theory of change, that once we adopt strategies that are honest about the external context and what role we can play in that, in transformation, then we really inevitably, I think, have to look at our design and say, how do we do that, right? And some people think of design as more of an internal challenge. How do we share leadership? How do we do decision making? And I just want to continue to argue that that's kind of how it feels. But I think we both feel this way. The way we do the work affects the quality of the work externally, right? And so to me, the design is really around those justice strategies.
Yeah.
It's not academic. It's so that we can be more effective in power building, in systems change, in helping groups challenge their own assumptions and practices, right? Like, if we're not designed to do that ourselves, how are we going to do that externally? So for me, it really is, it starts with strategy. And for JustOrg Design, it starts with strategy.
Yeah, that was when you initially said that, it was, how you have those like like that was because of course, right? When I hear you say it, of course, we should be designing our organizations around the strategies that we're trying to pursue. That's how you ensure that you actually accomplish what you set out to do. And I would add another layer, which is that leading with strategy also allows you to test whether or not your assumptions, because that's what in large part to me strategies are, they're your best assumption at how to get from here to there. In doing that, in leading with strategy, you also get the opportunity to test out those assumptions and to iterate and adapt. Completely upends, though, the idea that an organization has to have this position and that position, and they need, it totally upends that, turns it on its head.
It does, and it's uncomfortable, right? I mean, even for those of us, and because we're flying the plane as we're doing this, and
Right.
people have identities and mortgages and relationships and
Yeah.
all these things, and this isn't just some creative exercise that doesn't affect people's lives. And so we are talking about a change management process, but I think it starts with, as you have, a theory of change that's serious. Right. And as you just said, that if you're serious about those methodologies, it's just illogical that the way the organization was designed for past strategies would match perfectly those strategies. I mean, let's just think about it in very logical terms. What we were doing 15 years ago is what we were designed around, and if you're saying now you want us to spend 40% of our time in these areas, well, we're not currently structured to do that. I mean, so in some ways I like to sort of de-escalate this. It's not an indictment of the past. It's not this mysterious thing. If those are the things you want to do, and as I said, in many cases, those are not departments. For some groups they are, but for many groups who are adopting the kinds of strategies that you are, it's going to have to weave into the existing work in lots of ways. And it's going to have to reframe what groups are focused on, in what ratios, with what set of questions. That's what we mean by designing around strategy.
I mean, to give a real life example for us, we have a fiscal sponsorship bookkeeping kind of financial services practice. And we also have a IT, kind of back office IT, an IT consultant practice. And for years, I would say to the two directors of those departments, I think your work is much more aligned than you might think. And they would, no, 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 no. Bookkeeping is nothing like IT. And for me, what it was is that what I saw as commonalities is that for the client, what you are doing is helping them be able to focus on their mission, basically, right? You are offloading a task, a set of tasks, a responsibility that, particularly for most nonprofit folks, is not their core competency, right? So we were saying we want to take that off your plate, and yet it was really hard for them to see. And so as a result of that, we could have the same client in both of those practices and programs and never know about the other, right? And when it came to measuring, evaluating our work, right? We would be like, well, I mean, what do you say? Like, did we get you your monthly reports on time? Is that really what I want to know? Or do I want to know as an intermediary that we are designing and offering the solutions and the resources, maybe not even solutions, the resources that are helping our clients be more effective? Right? That's the measure of success. If it's just that somebody, sends the monthly financial reports other than somebody else, and not only that, Jeanne, but we want to over time be building capacity in their organizations, right? So that's another really important, that's another measure of change. Can we talk a little bit about, I know for me, and I don't know if this is true of everybody, but the CEO as leader, as all, which is often the case. For years, people have known me, but not always known, all of our team. But can we talk a little bit about hierarchy and shared leadership? And I feel like sometimes these things come up. I think I try not to get too cynical, but it's like the latest, greatest thing. So I do definitely feel, one, I feel challenged by this idea that Yodit is the single charismatic leader of new. I feel challenged by that. One, in my own identities, like that's not how I roll. My own um, politic is one of Black feminist, theory and womanist theory, which is more intersectional and more collective. So I've always personally struggled with that, although it has been my pride to lead this organization. And I've also struggled with, there are times when my team needs my experience, my institutional knowledge, my reputation, my spheres of influence to move our work forward. So just can you unpack a little bit in thinking about what it means to design our organizations towards justice? Like, how do we address that paradigm?
Right. Well, thank you for laying that out. It resonates a lot. And I do think a lot of times when we present as JustOrg Design and we have an allusion to justice in our title, the immediate assumption is we're helping deconstruct hierarchy, and that hierarchy is the enemy in the just design process. And that's not true. I think in almost all cases, at least in nonprofits and philanthropies that I'm around, there's a benefit to hierarchy and there's a reality. That's what you just said. There's a reality to hierarchy, which is that some people have more expertise and have taken on more responsibility for the big risks of the organization, strategically, financially, network positioning wise, et cetera. And they're better positioned to lead that risk taking.
Yeah.
So to me, it isn't, I think we get trapped in the binary of flat or hierarchical.
Yeah.
Having said that, we all know abusive hierarchies and we all know overly bureaucratic organizations and we all know decision-making bottlenecking and we know all the things we don't like about usually what we mean when we say hierarchy. And so again, when we talk about design, what I want to leave people with is we're not only talking about the org chart. Okay,
Yeah.
we're not only talking about titles and reporting lines. And I think that's what people are thinking of. And actually, that's maybe 10 or 15% of your design, right? Then it's how do you mix those configurations of people on, the core work, the change initiatives, the learning edges, right? How do you create their spaces, staff meetings, board meetings, community stakeholder meetings, again, change initiative spaces. So we don't think of the design as only the titles and reporting structure. That's one aspect of it.
Yeah.
But really the design is all the different ways you configure and energize groups of people to pursue strategy.
Yeah, that's good. All of those. Does that brings to my mind, Jeanne, does that mean that our design could be changing all the time? Or at least,
I think it's dynamic. That sounds better than changing
yeah,
all the time.
there we go. Yes.
So we don't lose people, so people don't turn us off. What we're seeing is that for a lot of groups, having a home team, probably a functional team, if you will, people working on the similar function or project is right for the design,
Yeah.
right? But what's missing is an infrastructure for them to innovate, collaborate across those functions, focus on some of the things like learning, right? Equity, evaluation, community constituent engagement, the stuff that we say we want, but that isn't any one of those functional areas responsibility, and that actually are probably learning edges for all of them.
Yeah.
So a lot of what we think of as the more dynamic part of the structure is that missing layer, which is where do those people meet and innovate and ideate, right?
Yes.
And that may only need to be, 2 or 3 recurring spaces that shift as the learning edges and change initiatives shift. But what I think we see doesn't work is creating these sort of one-off task forces and not treating them as part of the structure. So if you want to talk about what's changing, I think, over time, that more dynamic space will affect the functional groups because they're going to learn and innovate in there in ways that probably do shift the way we might group the functional work. So there's almost a dialogue going on, right, between the sort of recurring functional work and what's emergent, for, to use a consulting term. But that's real for organizations. There usually is always something or some things emergent. And where do we attend to that? Right. So that's the part that's a little more dynamic and maybe is not led by a director, but is co-convened by people from those spaces, from those functional spaces who have a lot of energy, who we want to develop as leaders. Right. And so it gives us more flexibility in our design and more room for the emergent, but not on a one-off basis, on a continuous basis. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. And diversity, equity, and inclusion got really popular, I think probably after, for us at least, it really ticked up after the 2016, 2017 election. And more recently, I think lots of folks have been talking about how do we elevate BIPOC leadership, how do we bring folks that have been excluded from these trajectories. And in practice, for me at least, I've observed two things. I've observed almost a tokenization of BIPOC, that's what it is, without culture, strategy, or design to support that leadership. And so as a result, we also have a lot of loss, right? A lot of turnover happening. The other thing is that it's like a policy or, a interpersonal relationship that's what DEI is. But for me, it often, at least when we were consulting with clients, it was not that conversation about how do we build more equitable, inclusive, diverse organizations was not happening in tandem with where is power, in our organizations, and how is that being shared and distributed? So for us early on, a couple of things that we did that weren't just about the people or the position or even the words, but about, well, if we're moving towards justice, and we loosely define justice as about being about repair, so repair for what's gotten us here, including exclusionary practices in hiring, but also designing with and not for the communities that we work with. And so where we started was actually bringing community closer to our strategic planning process, right? So that they were informing the strategic direction of the organization, and into our evaluation. We got really clear about who did we want to hear from. Now, to your point, those were pieces that were added to somebody's job, right? And we got to a point where it's not enough for one position or one department to be doing these things. We need to build the capacity of the entire team to ask itself the question, who am I designing with? And how do I know I'm not designing for, right? To me, that was like next level DEI work, right? More than just how we were changing our relationships with each other or building our consciousness around, race or gender or sexuality or other dimensions of diversity, but how were we inculcating and sharing and distributing the power even inside of the organization with those folks we serve, right?
To me, that's, again, we want to leave people, I think, with in part today is a much more expansive idea of what we mean by design. And that's that example of, in many ways, leadership's job is what prompts are people given for those spaces.
Yeah.
Right. And that's actually the leadership question is if I'm going to ask people to come together and advance this theory of change, what am I giving them sort of the canvas to paint on, right? So a question like, how do we get community more proximate to our design of the work and our evaluation of the work? That's a prompt, right? That we can't just expect everybody to come up with, right? But that's how that space becomes more purposeful and more integrated into the design than a quote DEI task force, right? Which we all, because that's the actual equity question from your perspective is how are, particularly BIPOC-led organizations informing us as much as we're informing them, as you said in your opening. So that if you design a space to go at that question and experiment with that question, that's what we mean. That's what I mean by design, right?
Yeah. What else? What else do you want to share in terms of this question of how then, what does it mean to design towards justice? Some other things.
Well, I want to go back to this decision-making question because it's one of the things that drew you to Sociocracy, this idea that, that consent is, of course, such a powerful and political and, potentially really transformational concept to center in an organization. And I don't think, because I think you're early, I don't think we even know yet the transformational capacity of that in terms of what does it really mean to consent to a strategy, to consent to a decision that maybe I didn't create and I didn't even initially understand, but now I'm giving my consent to. I think there's a lot there, and I know you do too. So I think we have a really, really destructive narrative in our organizations that group decision making in any form is inefficient, uninformed, sort of, pandering to the things of the day, but really, come on, not how leadership and organizational development really happens. And I think that's one of the first things that leaders need to unlearn, because my truth is, I haven't seen you even try it. Not you, the people who are saying that. When was the last time you framed up a decision elegantly, gave people time to discuss it, did a temperature check? Tell me the last time you even really, truly, genuinely tried to do that. Is that even built into your model? I think what most people are saying is, I'm ambivalent about making decisions now because I'm a positional leader. And so we're kind of stuck. We're all going like this.
Mhm.
Okay, that's a description of a state of being,
Yeah,
but that is not an analysis of how effective group decision making happens because you haven't tried it yet, right?
right.
You're stuck between we don't want to be top down, but we haven't taught ourselves any methodologies or practiced them at a
Mhm.
monthly meeting. So like, let's slow down before we write off
Right.
what groups are capable of, because it's actually a competency that we can build, you
Mhm.
know? Autumn Brown, Adrienne Reeves' sister, who does a lot of work on consensus work, and oh God, consensus, it takes too long, blah, blah, blah. She
Mhm.
says consensus does not require equal power. It's not
Right.
about flatness. It requires a process for equal voice.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that that voice is going to win. It doesn't,
Right.
it doesn't mean that that's how we're going to make it means
It's not
that
binary like
it's
that.
not
It's not
binary.
about a win-lose. No.
No. And you
Yeah.
could say at the beginning of a meeting, we are going to make this decision today. We've already talked about this, 3 or 4 times. I think we really understand the tensions and the themes in this discussion.
Right.
I've already laid out why it's important for us to make this decision now. Like it's
Mhm.
now we're tipping past the point of
Mhm.
no return here. And here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to lay out the proposal. We're going to hear you see what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Like that's actually not inefficient. I'll tell you what's inefficient is deferring that decision, making it and sending it out in an email that people resent and don't understand and don't
Right.
know how to incorporate into their own work.
Yeah.
And so we're not putting a price tag on how inefficient the way we're doing decision making is now. And so
Already. Right.
I already, especially in our state of ambivalence about power. So now we're not good at hierarchy, but we don't know what to replace it with, right? And so I
Mhm.
think what sociocracy is offering,
Yeah.
in your case, and what just a more precise approach to organizational design in general is offering us, is
Mhm.
yes, we can make decisions.
And we were actually stuck a little bit in that consensus paradigm. It was really important to me to hear from others, but we'd not spent enough time in, well, how will we make a decision, right? And so we got better at that, about being clear who's going to make the decision in this situation, at least making that transparent. What sociocracy got me is that we could put a proposal forth for a decision and actually hear from every person, as opposed to the majority, where you miss the nuance, you miss those nuggets that the dissenters might give you. But also, Jeanne, what I love about sociocracy is it requires 100% responsibility for the outcome. So you don't get to say, right, well, I don't like that idea, and then we're not going to make a decision, and then you're frozen, right? Because it's, you have inertia. Versus, I don't like that decision, but here is a counter proposal to what you've put forth. It's only been, 6, 8 months of actually regularly practicing sociocracy, but I love that. I love then that folks who never spoke up before in a meeting, because of our rounds where we check in with everybody, and also because they're very clear about our desire to get to consent and the value for the dissenter, right? Especially if it means we're going to get like more generative ideas around something. That really pulled me differently even than, and it's not perfect, and consent and consensus are mostly the same in sociocracy's world, except that you really are trying to get to the point where the decision is fully supported by the group, even if that's at varying degrees of support, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And I just maybe to put a pin in this, I think we are in a moment right now in progressive organizations where we have talked ourselves to a truth that we just, cannot do decision making. And that is an unacceptable final stance,
Mm,
right? If
mhm,
we're going to be practicing liberatory,
mhm.
thinking, if we're going to be practicing innovation together, if we're going to be practicing leadership development, it's just an illogical and unacceptable final place. And so
Yeah.
what I would say is, as part of imagining the future together, I think you know, and I'll call leaders in a little bit. I think they need to have the courage to say that decision-making is going to become a practice and a competency in our organization. To not do
Mhm.
that, however you do it, use sociocracy, use, you know, 5-finger consent, use
Right.
consensus if you want, use, you know, there's plenty of tools out there. But to just say we can't do it, it literally sort of just says then that there's no reason for us to feign group
Yeah.
process or shared leadership, because really we don't believe in our capacity to
Yeah.
negotiate and deliberate together, you know? I
Yes.
mean, there's a fatalism to that that I just can't live with, you know?
Yeah.
But it takes some time and some practice and some commitment and some transparency from positional leaders to say, let's try this. Let's try
Mhm.
this, you know?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's really powerful, especially this invitation to um just throw away this idea that we can't, that and I mean, I understand it. I understand also that sharing decision making is scary for folks because what if what people want us to do is not what we want to do or not we don't have enough resources for or but I think you inviting us to think also about what is the risk to the organization, right? Of not um thoughtfully and meaningfully engaging the folks you bring around your work. So important. Yeah. Mm,
We do a lot of talk as leaders, we do a lot of talking and analysis about what each person is capable of. And what would they
mm,
do if I let them in on this? And what will they do if we put them in this? And I know that's part of it, but I don't know about you now, having consulted for 2 decades and hearing that from each new person I meet. Oh, you know, this person's not capable of that, and this person's not capable of that, and we can't put these two people on this group. And so
mhm,
much of our time as leaders is spent in that kind of behind the scenes analysis of each individual's capacity and trying to tailor, you
mhm,
know, structures and relating structures to that. And one of the things I also think that is good about sociocracy or any kind of systemic design is that
mhm.
it lifts up away from these each by each,
Yeah.
person by person choices, and actually tries to teach a set of behaviors and practices that everyone can learn,
Yeah.
right? And it depersonalizes a little bit, because I do think there's a way that leadership becomes kind of infantilizing and patronizing, even when it's coming from a good place,
Mhm,
which is, oh, she could never do it. No, don't put her in that. She really doesn't. It's like, what if these are our practices as an organization?
mhm.
And we actually train people to them, and everyone gets the support they need to learn those practices. That's kind of what I think not kind of, that's definitely what sociocracy is
Absolutely.
after. And that's
Absolutely.
really what we mean by design writ large, is that the spaces are designed, the competencies are named,
Mhm,
and it's
mhm,
less individualized and it's more
mhm.
kind of collectively behavioral, do you know?
Absolutely. And I mean, I guess it makes me think about, you were talking about hierarchy earlier, and I think you we have these kind of binary thoughts like, oh, it is hierarchical or it's not. But I'm actually interested in getting up underneath the colonial practice of hierarchy that ties value to things that like, advanced degrees or how many years you led another organization and while there's value in that, that's where I think that kind of in systemic oppression happens is because we don't even invite once they say what you said, like, oh no, she couldn't, whoever she is, it gets never even gets invited to the kinds of conversations that leaders are in. And therefore, I think we get into a bit of an echo chamber. I think we get into groupthink. And for me, the more distance I have from my folks that are on the front lines, if you will, of our work, the more out of the loop I am. Like they actually know more about our business these days than I do. And so I want them to be involved in decisions. Any final thoughts before we wrap up? Gosh, I feel like we could do this for 2 hours. I love talking with you, by the way.
Oh, likewise, likewise. Just to validate or sort of reverberate back, I think, some things that were implied in your opening remarks. We also don't stop the design at the paid staff, right? And so thinking of our organizations as our board members, our key stakeholders, our donors,
Yeah.
our constituents. So again, thinking expansively, and Sociocracy encourages it too, not only staff have to be in circles, right?
Yeah.
That you can create a circle for a particular initiative that may be a multi-organization initiative. So again, as we sort of back up from that org chart and our compensation framework and think of design as all the different ways, quote unquote, within our organizations, but also in the ecosystem field, movement we're in, we have so much more latitude to, get people, the right people proximate around the right questions.
Yes, yes. For us, you alluded to this. So sociocracy, speaking of kind of structure, sociocracy, rather than the kind of triangle model we're accustomed to, it uses a circle structure. And in that, it moves governance from, in the case of nonprofits, something that's happening at the board level, to governance being all of our work. We are all different pieces, if you will, of the governance and stewardship of this mission and organization. And what I was finding, and I see this with a lot of our clients, is that there's a lot of power hoarded on the board, or just a division. Like, board is having a conversation and an experience with the organization very different than what staff have, and there aren't that many collisions or intersections of those conversations happening. And while I had less of an issue here with News Board in particular around sort of power hoarding, what I had was just a wall between my staff and the board, and me having to be kind of the broker between that. And so in shifting to this circle model, they have kind of these double linkages. And so not a ton has changed, believe it or not, in moving to this, because I think we were sort of primed for it. But the biggest thing is that there's more fluidity across those important elements of governance, right? So there's more dialogue happening from board to staff, and there's more work happening. And then even the formation of one of our circles, which brings together all of the members of client-facing teams at New, right, to be talking more strategically about how the linkages of their work and what's working, that they're trying, so that they're sharing, understanding and resources with each other. So excellent point about this idea of design extending past just staff, and certainly past just org chart, but really how can people come together in these spaces to strategically help us move forward? Yeah, super important. Well, I think I'm going to wrap us up here, but I do want to thank you. And I do want to lift up that if folks are watching or reading this and are interested, that you're going to be one of our guest facilitators at our upcoming Social Sector Strategies Symposium. S4 is happening October 17th, 2024. Yeah, 9 to 3:30. Super excited. We'll have Trista Harris, who's a futurist there, some folks from Birth Detroit, where they're really thinking a lot about how to design a way in which to amplify BIPOC birthing centers across the country, right? So a single organization here, but because they were open to a design shift, they're now able to have impact and work collectively for birthing justice, and some other exciting folks. So you can visit www.new.org for more about the S4 event on October 17th. And at 11, I think that's your session, is at 11 on designing our orgs for justice. So I look forward to that.
Me too.
Thank you for your time today, friend.
thank you for this dialogue and for all that I've learned from you and from New.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, everybody. See you soon.